Give a few minutes while our participants enter the space with us. So great to see so many people joining us this afternoon. This is wonderful. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. Welcome to our Harvard Law School Library Faculty Book Talk series. This talk is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel in about a week. You can check out our scholarship at Law Blog for more information about the recordings and upcoming book talks. I want to thank Dean Manning for his generous support of these talks, and a really big thank you to our team, Maya Bergamasco, Anna Martin, Rachel Parker, Teresa Mapp, and Debbie Ginsberg for helping us put together this series. We welcome your questions from our panelists, and we'll invite you to use the Q&A feature throughout the talk. Time is reserved at the end for our panel to engage with your questions, so please enter them in the Q&A as questions arise for you. Please visit your local library or your local bookseller, including the Harvard Coop, for a copy of today's book, Saving the News: Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve Freedom of Speech. It's my pleasure to introduce today's author, Martha Minow, and our esteemed panelists, Vicki Jackson and Nikolas Bowie. Martha Minow is the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard Law School, where she has taught since 1981. Professor Minow served as Dean of Harvard Law School between 2009 and 2017, and as the inaugural Morgan and Helen Chu Dean and Professor. Vicki Jackson is the Lawrence H. Tribe Professor of Constitutional Law here at Harvard Law School. Professor Jackson writes and teaches about the U.S. Constitution, federal courts, and comparative constitutional law. She writes on a range of subjects, including free speech, pro-constitutional representation, the Supreme Court, judicial independence, and methodological challenges in comparative constitutional law. Nikolas Bowie is an associate professor of law at Harvard Law School. He is a historian who teaches courses on federal and state constitutional law and local government law. His research focuses on critical legal histories of democracy in the United States. He has written about the exclusion of workers in corporate governance, the exclusion of immigrants from constitutional governance, and the relationship between self-government, written constitutions, and judicial review. So I turn it over to you, Professor Minow.
Well, thank you so much. And I give my deep thanks to everyone in the library. This series is one of my favorite things to do, even before COVID and especially during. And a very big shout out to the panelists who are my dream team interlocutors. I wrote a book because I'm worried. I'm worried about democracy. I'm worried about the actual jeopardy to truth and the Enlightenment values, although the Enlightenment had its own problems. And I can't help but think about when Ben Franklin left Independence Hall. Allegedly, a lady asked him, well, doctor, what if we got a republic or a monarchy? And Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. One of the elements of that republic calling for self-government was to have a news industry, to have a ecosystem of news. A political order controlled by the people needs people who are informed and who can actually know what they are voting about. The press is the only private industry that's mentioned in the Constitution. Well, actually, the First Amendment added in 1791. And the presumption is that it would exist. And we come now close to the many anniversaries of this nation, and news we know is at risk. So is democratic governance, which depends on an effective watchdog news media. The ecosystem of news has changed dramatically, more than anyone could have imagined over the last 200 plus years. Half of local communities now have, if any newspaper, only one, or any news source. There are steep declines, and this is a sharp difference from what was true at the time of the revolution, and even more notably, when de Tocqueville visited the United States and was stunned to see that people way far away from cities and towns actually had news, had newspapers, read them, and avidly discussed it, more than he had seen in Europe. Critical efforts to strengthen particularly local news are underway, but major tentpole organizations, my hometown, the Chicago Tribune, they're in free fall. A majority of people in the United States now receive news selected by computer-based mathematical formula based on either their past interests or what the algorithm thinks someone, that person would want to see. The digital platforms are winning in usage, profits, and revenues from advertising. And meantime, that's had a real impact. The legacy media, as it's called, is shrinking, cutting staff, relying on freelancers, if anything. And we all know that digital platforms are complicated and mainly don't believe that they're even in the news business. They actually are more likely to escalate messages and posts and information based on the ability to engage people and keep them engaged, which sadly often means keep them enraged. As the Facebook whistleblower helped us all to see. The internet, social media platforms are insulated from the liabilities that apply to conventional media, defamation, false information, threats. This is under the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, in essence, giving a subsidy to these entities that once were thought to be fledgling and in need of government help. At this moment, they're among the largest companies in the history of the planet. I don't think they need that help. And there's remarkable convergence over criticisms of this immunity among Republican and Democratic elected officials at a time when there's very little agreement about much else. I argue in this book that government should act and that it can act to tackle the rapid declines in the news industry. Some concerns that the First Amendment bars government action related to speech and press seem misguided in my mind, particularly given the extensive history of government involvement in shaping the news industries, in subsidizing it, in regulating it. And at the moment, there is a very real need for some kind of action. Otherwise, the very activities that the Constitution was meant to enable are in jeopardy. I described 3 different kinds of approaches, and depending on how you count my recommendations, there are either 11 or 15 of them, but the 3 different kinds fall into these categories. The first is to actually try to hold these internet platform, social media companies like responsible adult actors. That is includes either eliminating that immunity or making it conditioned on activities, including subscribing to codes of conduct, including actually sharing and making transparent their curation practices. But there are other ways to hold these entities responsible, like normal adult companies, like enforce their terms of service agreements, like actually also enforce the copyright law. A second bucket of solutions is more aimed at protecting users and readers. Consumer protection laws, laws against fraud. Some exist, some could be strengthened. It's fascinating to me to see how Europe is doing much more to protect ordinary people when it comes to social media than the US is. And I don't think in a way that jeopardizes our First Amendment freedoms, which frankly are the most robust in the world. I think there could be required disclosures about where messages, links, and sites and posts come from. Free speech values anonymity, but there could be requirements of disclosing whether the entity funding it or supporting it is public, nonprofit, US, or international. And I'm very interested in a proposal that really took form after I published the book, which is to require the internet companies to open up to competition over content moderation. This has been given the name middleware, which would give users more choice and could produce competition to improve content curation. I also think in this category, there could be taxation of internet companies with the revenues set aside to support news development and public alternatives, which points to the third category of actions that I think would begin to help. And that is to support, amplify, and sustain a variety of public interest news sources at the local, regional, and national level. Public media is among the most trusted media in the country, regardless of the political affiliation of those answering the question, and also nonprofit media. There could even be support for local news entities that are organized for profit, but at the moment are making not very many profits. The Local News Sustainability Act is currently pending in Congress. It's bipartisan. It would go further and allow tax deductions for individuals who take out subscriptions to local media outlets and for businesses that take out ads in local media, and also exempt from payroll taxes media hiring of journalists in the local context. I think we could imagine more government support to grow on the demand side for reliable news, media education. And also it's fascinating to me to see when polled, people want better sources of news, even if those algorithms tracking their paths don't reveal that. Now, there are some legal challenges that some might bring to some of the proposals that I've raised. Much of First Amendment jurisprudence has really taken a negative view, dictating what government must not do. And there are some concerns many have raised about the government being proactive, but we have a long and very distinguished history of government funding of public media with a lot of very thoughtful efforts to make sure the government doesn't control or influence content. And there are affirmative action elements of the First Amendment already recognized even by the Supreme Court, like the right of listeners to receive information. I do think to the extent that the Supreme Court has been turning the First Amendment into an anti-regulation machine, some people call it the new Lochner, that's a mistake. So, for example, some hints that required disclosures about where information is coming from would violate the First Amendment. That's a surprise, given what the Supreme Court has said in the past. Well, I really look forward to the conversation. I'm just delighted to have this chance to be in this community to talk about really topics very dear to my heart and I think very important for the future of democracy. I think, is Vicki going next?
I am happy to go next if that's the plan. So thank you, Martha, for your wonderful talk and for a book that I think is absolutely mandatory reading for anyone who cares about the quality of our constitutional democracy, because I don't think it's a book only about journalism and the press. I think it is really about what I would call the infrastructure of knowledge in our democracy, which consists of a set of knowledge institutions, of which the press is one. Professor Minow is eloquent and convincing on the vital constitutional role of the press in securing our democracy. I'll elaborate just briefly. Recent studies show that in local areas where newspapers have gone out of business, rates of corporate corruption in those areas have risen. But it's not just corruption that's held in check by an independent press. There's all sorts of government wrongdoing and wrongdoing by powerful private entities that we expect independent journalism to tell us about. They have the resources to be able to do so, even where we're not talking about wrongdoing, but some new phenomena of grave public concern, like a pandemic. We look to the press to tell us what is going on. The press is distinctive, as Professor Minow points out, from the general citizenry, whose speech rights also play important checking and truth advancing functions. But the press is distinctive. It has an institutional apparatus that can support investigative journalism, an activity that few citizens working other jobs can pursue. The press is also distinctive in having internal processes to check the objectivity or reliability of what's being reported. And as ongoing entities with continuous audiences, the press also have capacities not only to report, but to correct or retract in meaningful ways. In these respects, the press is one of those knowledge institutions I mentioned. Others include universities. They include some government offices whose statutory mandate is to identify objective information. Think Census Bureau. These knowledge institutions are essential to well-functioning democracies. Each such institution is in theory independent, or to some extent independent of the government. And each does or should adhere to a set of disciplinary norms designed to promote truth-seeking or knowledge-seeking in carrying out its work. Now, these knowledge institutions are, to some extent, interdependent. They depend on one another in ways that vary by subject areas. So, for example, the press, as well as academics, depend on some government offices for information, like the National Weather Service or the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And of particular relevance here, academic work in history, law, political science, sociology, and other social sciences is very dependent on news reporting. If you review the footnotes in law books or law review articles, you will see this. Now, Professor Minow's book is primarily focused on the threats to independent journalism that have arisen from a combination of government policies and the rise of social media in a very polarized environment. But we also live in a time of rising authoritarianisms, which have targeted knowledge institutions. Who are the targets? Universities and independent researchers. I recently saw J.D. Vance, a Yale Law School graduate and candidate for office in Ohio, quoting Richard Nixon's statement that the professors are the enemy. This comes right out of fascist and totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union. The press obviously has been under political attack and was described by our former president as the enemy of the people. Independent civil servants in government are under attack, as are the courts, which we rely on, in fact, for some degree of independent journalism. So the disappearance of independent journalism, as Professor Minow has documented, is part of a larger phenomena that threatens our democracy and democracies in other parts of the world as well. That's point one. And now I have two questions for Professor Minow if she feels like engaging with them. So Professor Minow's bucket of proposed reforms is, first of all, brilliant, innovative, inspiring, and many of them, I think, could be achieved without having to define who the press is. But some of them might require such a definition. So I was wondering what Professor Minow thought about this. Some writers in the field say, oh, it's impossible to identify the press. I'm not sure I think it's so impossible. Scholars like Sonia West have argued that there are criteria one could apply to determine who the press is, having to do with regular publication, regular audience, editorial capacities, and so forth. The IRS applies a multi-factor test to figure out what a church or temple or religious organization is. I'm not sure it would be impossible to do the same for the press. So I wonder what Professor Minow thinks about this, and whether, if there were a need to define, whether there might be a role for looking also at whether a particular media organization subscribes to a code of ethics that protects core features of the press function, or belongs to a voluntary association of media that subscribe to such a standard. I've learned that there are actually a lot of these codes of conduct for journalists out there in the world, and that according to the most recent academic study I could find, this is of not just US press organizations, but around the world, that the principles of truth and accuracy are among the most common things found in those codes, typically consisting of the duties of verification, separation of fact from opinion, and correcting mistakes. We can talk more about those if it is relevant, but the question in this part of my talk is, do some of the reforms you're thinking about require the ability to identify what counts as a good media organization? And if so, what kind of criteria might you recommend? And the last question I wanted to raise has to do with this very intriguing idea in Professor Minow's book about constitutionally inflected reforms. That may be the title of one of her last chapters. As you've heard, Professor Minow argues that the First Amendment in the US should not be construed to obstruct government efforts to protect freedom of the press from abridgment. But she's gone a little further in suggesting that First Amendment values might actually call for certain kinds of changes. And you heard about the changes to Section 230's protection from liability. And elsewhere, she also talks about the possibility that the First Amendment might actually impose a duty on the government to take certain actions. So I guess the question I have is to unpack a little bit what the idea of constitutionally inflected reform might mean. So one idea is it might mean that these reforms are things over which Congress has complete discretion. It can act or not, but it would be a nice idea if it did because it would help First Amendment values. Another idea that might be implicit is that while any specific reform is not constitutionally required, some efforts, some package of reforms to prevent abridgments of freedom of the press are constitutionally required. This idea that while some specific measures are not required, but some measures towards the constitutional goal are required, is a commonplace in many contemporary constitutions. Now, and I can talk more about that if people are interested, but if we understand her argument about constitutionally inflected reforms to be that the government has a constitutional duty to act affirmatively to promote press freedom, there remains the question of whether that duty is justiciable or not. Not all constitutional duties are necessarily justiciable. And to the extent that it depends on the enactment of legislation, one might think courts can't decide on that. But it might matter in the arena of political constitutionalism, of what arguments about constitutional duty might be persuasive. If we think of these calls for reform as ways of implementing a constitutional duty to protect freedom of expression. So the question for you is to help us understand a little bit more the idea of constitutionally inflected reforms. Thank you again for a marvelous book.
Thank you so much, Professor Bowie.
Yeah, just echoing Professor Jackson, I want to thank you for writing an incredible book, which I found to be an important and timely intervention in a crucial component of democracy, political education. And so similar to Professor Minow's emphasis on republicanism and the importance of preserving the values of what makes the United States a republic, I think of democracy as relying on a similar foundation of political equality, or at least the pursuit of political equality, creating a community in which all of us are equally empowered to make community decisions. And so the relationship between the press and political education on one hand with democracy, I think is mutually reinforcing, and the book emphasizes this. I read echoes within the book of Elizabeth Anderson's focus on epistemic democracy, or the idea that democratic norms of free discourse, of dissent, of dissemination of information to all, and the recognition that all can contribute to information are really important for ensuring that collective decision-making brings in a diverse body of experience, and that the decisions that we as a society make reflect all of our inputs and address all of our needs. It's really difficult, I think, to imagine a democracy that is functional in which people do not have any conception of what is happening or what the government is doing, or even how policies are affecting their own lives. But I think there's also inherent tension in democratic epistemology that the book really sort of argues against. And it was a tension that was first raised, or at least famously raised over a century ago by Walter Lippmann in Public Opinion, which is that citizens just don't, have never had all the information that you would need to actively participate in democracy. So Lippmann wrote in 1920, even I, a public intellectual who makes a living on writing about issues of the day, cannot find time to do what is expected of me in a theory of democracy. That is, to know what is going on and to have an opinion worth expressing on every question which confronts a self-governing community. So Lippmann was writing, at the rise of, telephone and radio, as opposed to Facebook and Google. But a lot of his complaints of the 1920s were very similar to the complaints in Saving the Press, including the sense that the consolidation of power among a handful of elites may be a threat to democratic self-government, at least as it's theorized. But for Lippmann, the solution was not, okay, so let's change this up and find new ways of bringing the people into the conversation. Lippmann's solution was, this is why democracy won't work, and this is why we need experts to guide us and to lead us and to allow the people to just pick between two very simple options, much the same way they might pick among advertisements. Do I want Downy or the other brand, as opposed to engaging in political conversations? And so I read Saving the Press as a refutation of that idea, that the answer or the solution to this problem of consolidation of information is to abandon democracy as opposed to revitalize it. And so I read the attack on the consolidation of modern media as a problem, in part because of the absence of information that consolidated media has access to. So to the extent that the press today means a handful of companies that are headquartered in New York or California, that means that people in Iowa, particularly small towns in Iowa, have no local source of information to make decisions about what's happening in local Iowa or in Des Moines or at the state level, but rather are getting information filtered through all sorts of other conglomerates out of state. There's a problem of epistemology that the current regime reveals. And another big problem is the sense of arbitrary rule, that to the extent that Facebook and Google and other conglomerates have this control over access to information and determining algorithmically what we think about the world around us, that's control that is not democratically accountable. And to the extent that the purpose of democracy, or at least one of them, is to hold our leaders democratically accountable and to hold them accountable to the public as a whole, as opposed to just what the experts think, then if the media suffers from the absence of democracy, we have a very similar problem where our entire reality is filtered through what a handful of people think. And so I take the argument of the book that we are living in a pretty unique period to be incredibly important. And what's unique about our period is not that the press today is partisan or not that we are uniquely ideologically divided, but the combination of a polarized press with the consolidation of where the press is that is resulting in this monopoly of information that is contributing to the ideological division. And so it's a combination of polarization with monopoly that I see as the real problem that is located in the book. And so I completely agreed with the diagnosis that this is the problem. And so my questions for Professor Minow are about the solutions. So the book emphasizes that we need to turn to the First Amendment to provide a solution or at least for guidance for two reasons. The first, as I read the argument, the First Amendment includes the Constitution's only recognition of private enterprise, which reinforces the centrality of the press. The second reason that Professor Minow turns to the First Amendment is because she interprets the centrality of the press in the Constitution as illustrating the centrality of the press to our constitutional republic. And so the argument is that the protection of the press by the government is not only permitted by the First Amendment, but is required. And that requirement that Professor Jackson just talked about in the language of duty is also reflected in the subtitle of the book behind Professor Minow's face in the Zoom screen, why the Constitution calls for government action to preserve the freedom of the press. And so my first response to the emphasis on the First Amendment, I guess all of these questions are, why is this a story about the First Amendment as opposed to a story about democracy? So one way of getting at that question is that the book emphasizes that the press is the private enterprise recognized by the government, or recognized by the Constitution. But I wonder if that imposes a modern public-private distinction on the term that at times is in tension with the rest of the argument. So is the argument here that the press is private or that it should be independent? And must the solution be market-oriented in the sense that the best way out of our current situation is through subsidies and through regulating the market? Or might a solution also be direct? So the United States spends, I think, less per person on public media than every other peer state. I think I read something that the United States spends $3 per person compared to Germany's $180 per person. And so to the extent that we're suffering from an absence of jobs in local media, then perhaps the solution is for the government to hire people, or at least to pay for local news sources to hire people to actually investigate and write the news. The book emphasizes that NPR and PBS are more trusted than the New York Times or Fox News. And I think the importance of the government's role in political education is reinforced by recent attacks on critical race theory in public schools. I think these attacks, while I completely disagree with them, reflect that control over the curriculum is obviously a political thing. What the government teaches young people is very important, and the government plays an essential role in educating the public to participate in democratic government. But so to the extent that the problem here is in part a result of market consolidation, might that suggest that the market is not the appropriate metaphor for thinking about what the solution would look like? I was reminded reading the book about the Works Progress Administration and the Farm Security Administration during the Great Depression, in which the federal government simply hired people to go around and document the Great Depression, interviewing formerly enslaved people, people who had been victims of the Dust Bowl, people who were really suffering from the Great Depression. I think of that as a form of political education quite analogous to the role of the press. It's hard to think of another term to describe it. But that's not simply subsidizing the press, it's actively hiring people by the government to go and be the press. And so I wondered what role that fits in to an argument that emphasizes that the First Amendment protects this private enterprise in the press. But then the second question is similar to the question that Professor Jackson raised, which is, I'm totally with you that the First Amendment should be interpreted to permit the government to engage in this form of subsidy. But why required? Requirement or an affirmative duty within the Constitution suggests to me that if the government fails to sufficiently protect the press, that this would be the subject of litigation, that we might expect courts to weigh in and say, is the government sufficiently protecting the press or not? But so what is the institutional or even the legal expertise that would give courts this understanding, or at least a superior understanding of what protecting the press looks like relative to legislatures? And so, part of me thinks that if, courts today are more originalist than ever, but history is really inconsistent here. Beyond the golden age of journalism that Professor Minow emphasizes between 1960 and 1980, the history of the press, is super contingent. The press in the 18th century is very partisan, very deregulated in some sense. And I wonder whether that sort of history might inform a judicial interpretation of the First Amendment that might be hostile to some of the reforms that she proposes. I'm also thinking of how trust in the media today is also a very partisan issue. where at the moment, it seems like Democrats are pulled to support the media and the press as an institution compared to Republicans. And as I just mentioned, the attacks on critical race theory suggest that control over the curriculum or control over what the government is doing in informing people about even basic things like history is highly political. So does the First Amendment provide guidance for what protecting the freedom of the press might mean? And what is the proposal for navigating these doctrinal conflicts? Because it seems to me that this is fundamentally a political question about what should the government be doing, what should the press be playing, what role should the press be playing, and what information should be promoted. So I guess the final thing about emphasizing the First Amendment is just that a lot of the solutions, which I completely agree with, emphasize the role of the states and local governments. And it seems like right now, given that Congress has a lot of difficulty legislating, a lot of information today is coming from local governments and states. Democracy vouchers are a recent innovation that cities have promoted, in which they give people vouchers in which they can give to candidates for as an alternative to public financing of elections. And I've read reforms proposing similar democracy vouchers for the media. Here's a $200 voucher, go give this to a media company that you want to support. So the summary, I guess, of these questions are just, why is this a First Amendment story as opposed to a democracy story? If the First Amendment only protected speech and not the press, would that meaningfully change the argument of the book? But all in all, I think this is incredibly important work, and I'm really glad that it's in print, which suggests, reinforces the importance of a free press in making democracy possible.
Well, these are just amazing comments and questions, and I'll say a few things going backwards from the most recent comments till the earlier ones, but I want to make sure that we have time to open it up. Well, my subtitle is Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action, not why the First Amendment. And so I really do have a more global sense of the constitutional requirement here than simply the First Amendment or even the private institution of the press. And it's precisely for the reasons that Professor Bowie just said. I always teach in constitutional law that the obligations to uphold the Constitution apply not only to federal judges, but to everyone who is a public official and who swears allegiance to uphold the Constitution. And I believe that there has been an abdication of the duties that really they're swearing to that are reflected in the stalemate in the Congress, and also the inaction by many state legislatures and local governments. I also think that there are obligations that citizens have, that people who live in this country have, and we all could play important roles to try to remedy the problems that I'm talking about. That said, I very much appreciate the succinct and perceptive combination of polarization and concentration that Professor Bowie puts forward. One of the challenges that really brings to mind that period of the 1920s, when concentration of wealth was understood to be a barrier or a problem for democracy, and antitrust law really took form. We have side-railed antitrust law when it comes to media for a variety of reasons that have a lot to do both with the academic theories coming out of the University of Chicago, that consumer pricing is all that matters as opposed to concentrated power, and also some strange ideas that, particularly with the internet companies, since they are offering their services for free, there is no price. And so there's nothing that poses an antitrust problem. I think those are just make weights. And yet I don't think, and I argue this in the book, that antitrust is the solution. I do think that concentrated power is the problem, is a major problem. But I would propose instead a public utility regulatory framework. And I'm glad to talk about that more. I think you both very perceptively ask, what do I mean by way of suggesting there's an affirmative dimension of the Constitution here. I did work hard not to say require. I came up with calls for and inflection, in part to be able to straddle the multiple meanings that Professor Jackson poses. I think at a minimum, the weak meaning is there, that the government is permitted to act. But that's not so minor given the aggressiveness of the Supreme Court in using the First Amendment to strike down regulation. So in that sense, it's really urging a restraint on the courts. I do think that there are duties but I'm less focused on courts than I am on other actors, as I just mentioned, like the legislature. And I think inaction is unacceptable. I very much like the idea of that's developed by Larry Sager and others of constitutional rights that are not to be enforced by courts, but have other institutional arrangements. And the idea of a democracy voucher is one form that could take. The Local News Sustainability Act pending in Congress that gives tax benefits to individuals who subscribe to local news and to businesses that take out ads in local entities. Those are examples. I think that there are a variety of ways to fulfill these duties, and creativity would be good, and decentralization particularly good. Have the 50 laboratories experiment. There are increasing bills proposed in state legislatures and even local governments to do exactly the kinds of experimentation that we're all talking about here, because people, whatever party they're in, whatever industry they're in, they know that their communities suffer if there isn't local news. And just to amplify the research that Professor Jackson pointed to about corruption increasing when there isn't news. When Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri and killed, and the Department of Justice did its expose, it showed not only the piling of fines and fees on the backs of poor people that were used to finance the legal system, it showed that there was no local news. So there was no one exposing those stories. And another story that I talk about a little bit in the book is Flint, Michigan, when lead was found in the water. I had the chance to talk with the public health official who blew the whistle. And she said to me, we're actually lucky. And I said, lucky? You have lead in the water. It is hurting your children. She said, well, but we had local news. She said, there are hundreds of Flint, Michigans in the United States, but they don't have local news. Ferreting out the stories and broadcasting it. So local news is essential, news is essential, and it's for the well-being as well as for the survival of democracy. Vicki Jackson's hard question about who is a journalist and what is news. I love the ideas of looking to codes of conduct for possibilities. The IRS does actually come up with guidelines for what's a religion, so why not for what's news? This is one of the holes in the pending Local News Sustainability Act. They don't define what's local, much less what's news. And there is a real danger of conglomerates and foreign entities using this tax deduction and disguising themselves as news. We already know that there are lots of entities that are pretending that they're news and they're not. They're just shills for a particular cause. And that is a problem. But I'll close here just by saying that I've been pretty harsh about the internet and internet companies right now. The good news goes to Professor Bowie's point about diversity. The barriers to entry that have existed in the media are severe. And the lack of diverse voices are very, very troubling, particularly in mainstream media. The lack of funding for minority media. Barriers to entry are down. There is, little shoots of life with microjournalism that's occurring in places like Chicago, my hometown, where there are block by block blogs that are reporting stories that never would have been reported before. And that's an encouraging development. I think that state, local governments, private citizens, philanthropy should all be rolling up our sleeves to figure out how to support the news industry and the varieties of ways in which news can be developed. I love a WPA project as well. There's Report for America, which is a wonderful nonprofit modeled on Teach for America to finance young people to actually spend time reporting locally. At the moment, if you go to a state house and you look at, is there any journalist here? The likelihood in over half the states is if there is a journalist, it's a student, because there are no local people covering the news for local entities. So I don't think we can have a democracy if we don't have that kind of work. So thank you so much. And let's see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you, Professor Minow, so much. And I'd like to encourage our attendees today to please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions to our speakers. And so while we're waiting for folks to percolate on all of these thoughts that we've shared, a question for Professor Minow, but also for our other two speakers. I'm curious to know more, if you could speak more about sort of the polarization of media, specifically TV news channels, for example. I noticed myself and amongst my friends in 2016 that I heard a lot of people saying sort of in passing that they're just looking for, like, just give it to me straight, you know, like just give me the news without anything particularly political. But do you think that kind of future exists, or do you think that's possible?
Well, as Professor Bowie said, in the 19th century, lots of newspapers were explicitly political. Indeed, in the 1840s, 1850s, major newspapers were financed by political parties. So in that sense, there's nothing new. And again, you know, to mea culpa of my criticisms of the internet, because in fact, more people get their news from Fox than they do from all of the other news sources combined. So there's cable news and networks, Fox in particular, are political. Some people have described Fox News as really a branch of the Republican Party. But again, that's not so new. At the same time, I do think that there are entities that actually aspire to a kind of balanced presentation or objective presentation. And even the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by the Murdoch Corporation, you know, if you don't read the editorials, the rest of it is really devoted to news and objective reporting, really quite excellent. And I think maybe developing some greater good housekeeping seal of approval, some way to signal adherence to those kinds of norms. You know, when Fox abandoned its phrase that implied balanced news, that they didn't even pretend anymore that they're doing that. To be nice to help all of us be able to know who thinks they're in this business and who doesn't. The public media absolutely is committed to reporting just the facts, but also competing points of view. There is this problem of false equivalency. How do you identify what a competing point of view is? Does that mean you bring climate change deniers alongside the people showing human contribution to climate change? But those are editorial judgments that it has taken centuries to develop norms around. And what the internet has done is it has eliminated those kinds of aspirations. It has not eliminated editing. There is editing going on. There's content moderation going on, often only with engagement and money-making involved. But I think it would be very helpful to even imagine requiring people to say, do you subscribe to these values or not?
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions from attendees. A first question here. Thank you, professors, for this enriching talk. In the context of the concentration problem identified by Professor Minow and the ideological polarization in society fueled by partisan big media, as explained by Professor Bowie, would increasing employment of political advertisements in social media create a conflict of interest for the state or government to any of the government-driven proposals in the book to regulate digital platforms? And how does identifying a constitutional obligation on the state under the First Amendment reach towards addressing this conflict?
Well, this is maybe a larger topic than even implied by the question, because one of the places where I think the Supreme Court has gone off the rails is rejecting campaign finance rules and rejecting the possibility of limiting candidates to only publicly provided forum for speaking. At the moment, it's just how much money can you raise, and it can be money not from your jurisdiction. And so I'm very much out of sync with what the current framework is in my own views. I do think that the hands-off approach of some of the platforms, Facebook in particular, when it comes to political ads, it's very troubling. And we see the consequences of the approaches, not just to political ads, but to content moderation that are very severe. Really, hundreds of people have died in India due to false information spread by Facebook. And there are problems, therefore, way beyond just politics here that I think call for regulation. I don't know if either of you have a comment about this. I see another question about how do we keep Big Brother out of the editorial office if the government is involved in subsidies? And of course, that's a huge question, a very, very important one. And one reason that I would have some concern about Professor Bowie's suggestion of government employing journalists. If the government employment of journalists is direct, I worry about government control of the content. We have developed in this country a pretty robust way to insulate public funding from government choices. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting gets money allocated by Congress. It allocates it in turn to public broadcasting networks. I should disclose I'm on the board of our public broadcaster here in Boston. We don't have anybody in the government telling us what to do there. But it requires some effort of insulation. And if there was more government support of the order of Germany, or for that matter, Great Britain smartly finances its public broadcasting as a fee on the sale of the hardware. And so it's not contingent on what political party is in office or what their views are. It's just there it is. And that's another way to come up with insulation. But it certainly requires a lot of care and thought. And is it fair to say there's zero government influence? Does a public broadcaster in the United States not think about, would this offend the government? Of course, there's probably some thought about that. But that's the same way that there's thought about any other finance, including private advertising. Private advertisers will say, we won't support this program. That's happened. So it's all the more reason why we need plural sources. We need public, nonprofit, government-supported, private market, local, national, international, in order to mix up those kinds of influences.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nico. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree with that. And while I think that government direct employment of journalists would be a good idea, I do not think it would be a good idea as like the only source of news. I think it's difficult to distinguish the press from other forms of education. And we have government employed teachers, and government employed teachers, there is the same risk of Big Brother. And we address it by forms of democratic accountability in the form of school boards, by debates over appropriate curricula, by active teachers unions that represent teachers and bargaining with the government. And so even when looking specifically at direct employment, it does not necessarily translate into dictation by a single official as to what will be disseminated. But I do think that in thinking about all of these questions, that I completely agree with Professor Minow that people respond to who is keeping them employed. You know, if journalists are employed based on the people who click on their articles, because clicks translate into ad revenue, which translates into keeping their job, then the sorts of articles people write are just different than if someone has a salary that is funded no matter what they publish. And so the thinking about financial incentives, as well as you know, the proliferation of internet ads as the source of all media, I think like that presents the concentration in the opposite respect, that to the extent that all media is coming from the same form of funding, then it's a similar type of Big Brother problem. And even though we might not think of Facebook and Google as Big Brother because George Orwell was writing about the government and not about these huge government financed and regulated corporations, that should still be an identical concern.
Great.
And I was just going to add that Professor Minow was getting at the idea of the use of intermediary bodies that may be created by the government, but not staffed by them. And a number of countries in Europe have experience with this in various press council formats. And does it eliminate influence? You know, no, we're all humans and human institutions, as you heard from both Professor Bowie and Professor Minow. And the other thing I was going to say is that, as I mentioned earlier, there are criteria that have been developed for determining what's a church, temple, or place of worship. There are 15 of them. None are dispositive. They're considered. And we don't have a lot of track record of the government telling churches what they can preach. The separation has held, and for the most part, been respected, not to say always, but one might imagine that something similar could be developed for defining a journalistic enterprise that was devoted to independent reporting about the truth.
Wonderful.
Great, thank you all so much. Unfortunately, I think that looks like all we have time for today. So I just want to thank, first of all, our three speakers today for sharing their thoughts, and also to our attendees for joining us. I quickly want to share that we have another library book talk. It's happening tomorrow at 12:30 on Zoom. It's The Broken Constitution, which is written by Harvard Law School professor Noah Feldman, and also features Professor Nikolas Bowie for back-to-back book talks. So again, thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you to our attendees. Enjoy the rest of your day.